This meeting is being recorded.
Is that us recording? Must...
They're trying to figure out how to share their screen, but all of the
see us. Yeah, Zoom, I guess.
yeah, through Zoom, they've got to figure that part out, but I think they don't need to. They would share the screen just fine.
Right. Okay.
So they just need to.
I think if they share screen, they can then change the viewer
Right.
presentation so that they can see the other screen on the side, having their presentation. Yeah, right. So I know your question with CB. It's changed here. Yeah, now I can see your presentation. You can see this. Can you read it? Yeah. They're muted, so I don't know. Hello? Wait with it? Okay. Hi, Fiona. Yeah, I guess, is that the mic we're using?
Hello, Fiona, can you hear me? I think you guys are muted. Can you turn on the microphone? Hi.
How's it going?
Good. We're trying to set up all the
Technical.
hello. They can't see me, but they probably can hear me.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear us?
Oh, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Perfectly.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah, we can't see you.
Yeah,
Well, I guess you did.
That's not a great line.
I was sitting at the.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear.
I'm here. And
I can hear you now perfectly.
But can
Can
you
you
see
hear
the
us
box?
okay?
We can.
Yeah, we can hear you good.
Awesome. And I saw you can successfully share the screen.
Great.
Everything good?
Brilliant.
Awesome. Is there any way we can see both? Like, is there any way that we
Good.
can see the classroom, but then also see?
Can you have two cameras set up on Zoom, Taya?
Or maybe we can just all sit here, right? Like,
Yeah, or use it in front of the screen, yeah.
I can go do it now. There we are. Can you see that?
We can't see your screen.
We see you.
it's through the network.
Oh, you can't?
Can't.
Okay, let me do share. Oh, I think I didn't share. Let me.
Did you share? Shared?
Yeah. How's that?
Here it is. Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so they have this pop up here. I can go full
Mouse
screen.
doesn't work.
I think that's great.
What's that one? All right.
We don't need double, but this is fine. I can get rid of this.
Well, we can't do any.
How do I move that forward?
do
I can't
that?
get my slide thing.
You look great.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, okay. How's it going? I'm sorry I couldn't make it to the first class. So first time in. Control.
I'm staring at the slideshow. I can't see the room at all, so it's a bit weird.
We can see your head in a little bubble and the slideshow.
Yeah, they said you.
So if they do, the challenge is sometimes you need to, it's this that they need, right?
Yes, yes.
This.
Can you go to the top right corner and see if you can change the gallery view of the screen so that you can probably see both?
Okay.
Top right corner.
The gallery view is here, but as soon as I share, it just disappears. There's
So-
speaker, multi-speaker.
Probably have to maximize the
Yeah, let's try that one.
Maybe you should share screen rather than if you share screen, you could see both. Do you want to try that? If you share screen, rather than when you do share, rather than the program, share
I think you're right.
desktop, and then maybe we see the
think
whole.
I
Try
think you
that
got
now.
it.
Try that now. No, that doesn't work either.
For what side?
Participants 3. Well, at least we can. There is an interface, so we can.
That's only for us.
I know,
right?
actually,
how
that's
does
why,
that-
that's why, so, so you see when you go to share, have you
Does that
tried
work?
to? We can see you and your screen, can you see us or not? So the side by side.
No, I just see the
is-
screen.
That's sharing yours.
But you know,
and
while
then-
the letter slides are on its side.
View show participants.
Yeah, so what happens if you go to the top, like share it?
Share entire desktop. No.
You're fine, I think you're fine, once you
yeah, I
click
don't know,
share, you're fine. It's what you have to
No, it's-
view.
So
Yes,
Molly speaker view. That's side by side, or you can do other layouts,
correct,
but
correct.
okay. View, yeah. I've got speaker, gallery, multi-speaker, hide
Yes.
self, hide non-video, show meeting time as full screen. Right now I'm on speaker. It's okay. I mean, if it's okay for you, you can actually see the slides, no problem.
Not right now, but yes, when you do share them, we
when you
can.
share, we can see, yes.
Yes,
It's weird that we can't see. You were in the room.
Right, can you see that okay?
yep, perfect.
Perfect.
Then
All
that's
right,
fine.
then whenever you're ready to go, we can go.
Great, and I would say that once you're done with the slideshow and we come back to the conversation part later, you could just unshare and then we'll just make sure you can see the class, so that'll make
Yep.
it more direct conversation for y'all.
Absolutely, we'll do that.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes, so,
Okay.
so y'all just kind
Shall I
of
start?
hold,
We're not in it.
no, about
All right,
10,
no
10:40.
problem.
Yeah, 10:40.
10:40. Okay, we've got 6 minutes.
Hmm.
That's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
But obviously, you don't have full capability with this. Well, I don't know, because the university's hosting it, so.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Didn't get the best at the- No, I'll keep an eye, I'll be over here.
can you see the chat if we put anything in there? Oh, you have to go out. Okay, cool. Okay.
No, I mean, I've done it now by unsharing and I can see it.
Okay, cool. No problem.
I'd have to go out, yeah, like I've just done.
Good to know. So I just mentioned that we have groups created and the Ching is putting
Gotcha.
those on board now. So when we get to the activity after the lecture, et cetera, and after the questions, we can, we'll have that ready to go later too.
Okay, just need to get that slide. The prompt. Remember for the exercise.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I think we are ready to go. They know what's going to happen today, and we're ready for your brilliance.
Okay, I'll start then. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us. We're really delighted to be able to plug into this project and work with you all as we kind of explore the process behind this project. So I'm going to talk, there's two of us, Fiona and me, but because it's on Zoom and it's a little computer, I'm going to do the talk. And then Fiona will come back and we'll answer any questions and join in the discussion and do the exercise together. So basically, speculative design for us has become slightly meaningless as a term. It can mean anything in a way. And we've become more interested in the idea of speculative thought, criticality and design. So what we're going to talk about today really is very much how we got into this space, why we kind of adopted these methods and how. Going to talk a little bit about how other people approach it in the middle, and then end with a project that we unpack in a little more detail to talk about how we go about doing this sort of thing. So Fiona and I, Fiona's background's in architecture, mine's in industrial design, and we've been working together now since we were students at the Royal College of Art in London in the late 80s and early 90s. And objects are very important for us, even though we deal with non-existent worlds, fictions, alternative realities. By making the things that belong to those worlds and bringing them into this world, we set up a kind of attention. You see a physical thing in front of you, it's there, your senses can embrace it. but conceptually and narratively, it belongs somewhere else. It doesn't quite make sense in this world. And that's very important for us, and why we focus on physical things. The second part of our work really is a focus on technology. And when we were beginning in the 90s, when we set up Dun& Raby, technology, certainly in the UK, was really beginning to kind of emerge and move from the office place and work environment into the home. And we were very concerned at that time that although there were tremendous opportunities for the internet, for example, and home computers, it was also bringing work and production values into an environment that previously was almost like a sanctuary. And when we graduated, we spent about 3 years in Japan. I worked for a big electronics consumer company and Fiona for a tiny architecture office. And we saw a different way that technology could exist, more poetic, playful, strange. And it sort of inspired us and gave us a glimpse into how technology could be different from the hyper-functional world we were seeing emerge in the UK and even the US at that time. As I did work in a huge, actually it was Sony at that time, at the end of the 80s and early 90s, I realized that isn't the direction I wanted to go in. And we saw from Fiona's office that actually there was a much more interesting possibility of borrowing the small architectural model, studio model, where you write, do theory, teach, work for clients, and so on. And that's how we tried to organize our practice. So when we decided in a way we wanted to use design to take a more critical approach to technology at a time when techno-utopia was everywhere, it was hard to find reference models in design. So we looked back to radical Italian design from the 60s and 70s, where people like Enzo Mari on the left, with that table, he designed the instructions for making a table, and then people could go out and make these tables and furniture out of found objects. Or Studio Alchimia, the middle slide, that kind of tried to move away from modernism and functionalism and readdress how furniture was designed in an ordinary everyday setting. But neither of them, none of these designers and their architects actually engaged with technology. At the same time, or even a little bit earlier in the 60s, you have people like Krzysztof Wodiczko, originally an industrial designer working in an electronics company in Poland, reacting against a communist regime at the time with this interactive object where you've got a big microphone on his forehead, 2 earphones and sensors in his gloves. And when he opens his hands, like the top right-hand slide, the sound enters clearly into his head. And then when he clenches the fists, the sound is distorted. And for him, it was a kind of a play on how technology could mediate his relationship to propaganda that was happening at that time. But he very much operated in an artistic context. And below that is Walter Pichler, another architect, who in the 60s built these wonderful, fully functional objects. In this case, it's a living room on the wearable living room. And he was very concerned with how at that time technology, TV already was starting to dominate the home environment. And we may eventually find ourselves being sucked into that world, which of course we are today with social media and iPhones. And again, he's an architect and he operated in a fine art environment and eventually he became a sculptor. So for us, it was an interesting challenge to say, how can we take the world of experimental conceptual furniture that had a long tradition in Italy particularly, and the kind of critical values that were emerging in media art, and bring them together as a form of design, using design language and contemporary design aesthetics and so on. We wanted it to be about design, not art. So one of the first projects we did was part of my PhD. It's called a Faraday chair. And it's a proposal for a box that's made from a data-safe glass. It's glass that are used in government office buildings to stop electromagnetic waves from computers and mobile phones leaking out into public spaces. And we wanted to suggest that as we bring more and more technology into the home, the kind of values it brings with us sort of force us to create these small retreats where we can shelter from electronic bombardment, in this case, the Faraday chair. So it's kind of meant to be a suggestion for a new kind of comfort, as many chairs are about, but in this case, a psychological comfort emerging in relation to electronic technology. And later on, we were commissioned to make a bespoke one for a particular person who wanted to sit in a very specific way. And it became part of the V&A Museum in London, the Victoria and Albert Museums, a furniture collection, and they kind of like the idea that this was marking a moment when furniture and the domestic environment might start to react, in this case, very critically to how technologies were entering the home. And other very important part of our work is reflecting on what we do. And we're very lucky to be able to do these experiments as part of our roles as academics. And we feel it's almost, it's a responsibility to reflect, write them up, and share them with a broader, especially design audience. And we try to write in a way that explores what does it mean to write as a designer and a practitioner, and how do you integrate text and projects into a book differently from how a social theorist might, or a philosopher, or even a scientist. So another project from around that time, this is from an exhibition much later in the mid-2000s, was called the Placebo Project, and we did it in 2000. And we were still interested in electromagnetic fields, the radio waves given off by computers and phones and other electronic objects, and the domestic environment. But in this case, this project, we wanted to design objects that people could borrow, bring into their homes, live with them for a couple of months, and then we could interview.
Tony, you're currently muted. And your screen is not sharing. You froze for a moment and the screen kind of popped out when you were talking about electromagnetic waves. Maybe it was the electromagnetic waves.
Yeah. Did you hear me before that?
I heard you. We heard the Faraday chair sitting in a specific position, VNA. You got to the slot. You talked about the book, and then you went to the.
Okay. Oh, I've just seen it. Weirdly, it got muted. I'll just share again. Can you see that?
Go back to the slide before that, though. Yeah, perfect.
Yep. Okay. So this was another project we did it says 2007, that's from that exhibition, but we did it in 2000. And at that time, there was a lot of concern about how mobile phones and other electronic devices in the home might affect our brains and bodies in different ways. And we designed these objects in a very neutral way to react to the electromagnetic fields in different ways. And they were made available for people to borrow through various advertising channels. And people adopted them for 2 months and lived with them. And then we visited the people and interviewed them to see how living with these objects might change their attitudes towards electromagnetic fields, not necessarily negatively, but poetically as well. So we worked with a photographer called Jason Evans, who accompanied Fiona, who did the interviews afterwards, to visit each of the adopters, as we call them. The top left-hand one is a table called the Lost Table. It has a GPS mechanism inside it. And GPS in those days was quite weak. So when it was indoors, it couldn't communicate to the satellites. It would just say lost. And the people borrowing it felt a tremendous pressure and responsibility to find a place where the table could communicate with the satellites and kind of fulfill itself. And then it would just display its precise location. That was a small family. Dick, the father in the family, said, when I come home from work, there's a sort of automatic routine. You come in, drop the bag. I glance over just to check it's got a position. And I always do so before I go to bed. When all the lights are off, I look out of the bedroom window. He had it in a glass conservatory at the back of their house. And there it is. It's really nice because there's a little green light there. It's a little comfort feeling. That's fine. All well's with the world. And I go to sleep. And if the satellites were spinning around the world and the table was connected, everything was calm. And I think what was interesting for us with this project was 2 things. Just introducing the word lost to a table created all sorts of playful and interesting psychological and emotional dynamics around a very bland object. And also how for them over time, this table started to sort of allow their imaginations to flow into almost a planetary scale and imagine themselves as their family as a tiny little speck in this vast electromagnetic network. So there was original black and white photos were responses to the interviews where Jason picked up on things they actually did or might have done with the objects. And then these are more documentary-like. So the one on the right-hand side are two women who borrowed the compass table. That was a table with 25 magnetic compasses in it. And whenever you put a phone or a computer on it, the compasses would all spin and show that the device extends beyond its casing. And they used that table to map their whole house or flat, showing where the fields were strongest. And you can just about see some pieces of paper on the floor which represent their maps. The woman in the middle has her hand on a chair that was, we called it the electricity drain stool. And you would come in after work, take your clothes off, sit on the stainless steel part, and it was connected to a cable that went into the mains, but only the earth part of the mains. We have slightly different plugs in the UK. And if you used your phone, the electricity would flow out of your body into the main system. And this is a system a lot of electromagnetically sensitive people use in their own lives. So later on, we had the chance to exhibit it. We were residents at the V&A Museum at that time in one of their collections, and we dropped little photographs of the objects being used or their owners amongst similar objects in the museum, trying to suggest that there's the official history of design as it's evolved over time. And this could be seen as a strange fictional branch where a more poetic and slightly strange version of design could exist. And again, that project was integrated into a book called Design Noir, which had the full interviews with the adopters, some essays, and our work and other people's work. And that was 20 years ago, but it was just republished a couple of years ago by Bloomsbury. So all those projects so far, they work. They're kind of, it was very important at that time that electronic things did what they were supposed to do. And although we didn't have Arduino, we had things like PIC chips and stamp to prototype them. It was a little bit more complicated than it is now. But it also meant you could only work with very basic technologies. And at that time, we were becoming very interested in robotics, even AI and synthetic biology, and wanted to apply this design approach, this slightly more critical approach, to these more advanced technologies. So we had the chance to do a project in Belgium and a small commission. They exhibited the other work, like the placebo work. And we'd just come back from a trip to Japan, and we were fascinated by the obsession with robots there and how in the West we kind of think of things like Roombas, highly functional and a bit boring, or the versions that appear in cinema that are very human-like and kind of anthropomorphic. And we wondered, what if robots were designed not as appliances, but as cultural objects? And we started not from saying how big is the technology and what kind of casing do we need to put around it, or how can we make it look like an animal or a human, but how do we manage power relations? As these technologies are becoming more substantial and even threatening, what size should they be? Where should they sit in relation to the human figure? How should we interact with them? And the second thing was we had almost no budget, so we made these objects from foam and wood, and of course they didn't work. And it sounds odd now, but at that time in 2007, we were extremely nervous that people would kind of dismiss them as ridiculous fictional objects that, bits of painted wood and so on. So this is a still from a shot from the studio where we made a small film to go with the objects. And Mo on the left there is about to pull a string linked to the red ring and drag it across the floor to give it a feeling of being animated. So I won't go into them all, but the one on the left is an object that maybe is a sentinel. It sort of manages your access to your bank, your most personal private details in the cloud, although we didn't have clouds then, but we thought a database. And rather than just say glance, it's an iris scanner, rather than as now we just glance at it and it's done in a microsecond, you hold this object in your arms and you stare into its opening for a couple of minutes. And we wanted to say, this device manages your most private and essential information. Is a quick glance really the most meaningful and reassuring form of interaction? Maybe you should hold something, pick it up, stare at it, feel its weight, and then it releases, that provides access to the data. So we were sort of starting from an interaction point of view rather than a technology or a form view. It's made in wood, again, to suggest it belongs in the world of furniture, tables, chairs, and shelving. And these things might continue to evolve in the future, rather than everything being like a dishwasher or a fridge or a cooker. This one was meant to be like a supercomputer. If you look in this slide, you can see it's on a little box with wheels and a string. And when it needs to do something, it calls you over, whispers it to you, and then you pull it into a position where it can do it. So it's designing a kind of interdependence into the technology, so us humans can still feel we have some authority and power over this advanced technology. And it's really a placeholder for saying, when we're designing advanced technologies, and especially the case with things like AI, the power dynamics are very important, and they're sort of ignored in how we give physical presence to these technologies and how that sits in the world compared to us. So here's a still of it in the exhibition with a video. And the video didn't really show this is how they work kind of video, but was more here suggesting some kind of strange and different interactions with robots that, again, don't look like robots. So as we said, at that time, we were very, very nervous about doing this project. It felt very risky for us, but the reaction was tremendous. A consortium of roboticist scientists from the European Union invited us. We were teaching at the Royal College of Art at that time, to join them and bring this kind of thinking into their project. And Microsoft Research in Cambridge in the UK wanted to sponsor, and did sponsor, a PhD in our department over 4 years, going deeper into this. And Intel ran a number of projects with us, and their office in Pittsburgh that specialized in robotics with Carnegie Mellon, where our students explored many, many different ways of thinking about robots in the home. And it sort of gave us a real feeling that this more speculative, fictional form of design could be valuable in discussion when you bring design into communication with these other highly scientific and technical disciplines. And many of the technologies they were dealing with didn't quite exist either. They might exist as a prototype in a laboratory, but they weren't in the world. So we were able to fast forward a little bit and say, well, what would happen when robots come in the home? What kind of things should we be thinking about? And then that kind of thinking would feed back into the research. So around that time, Fiona and I had the opportunity to lead a department at the Royal College of Art in London called Design Interactions, which was traditionally an interaction design and digital design department. And we proposed that should expand its remit to embrace biotechnology and other emerging technologies. This was about 2005. And it became a sort of a home. It's a postgraduate course or graduate course, about 16 students per year. And the students were attracted were kind of industrial designers who didn't want to do industrial design, architects who didn't want to design buildings, graphic designers who didn't want to do graphics, psychologists who didn't want to do psychology. But everyone was interested in trying to grapple with how technology was impacting on our lives, and took a critical approach and explored new methods and new ways of critiquing it and bringing it to different public contexts. And we worked a lot with engineering and science schools around the UK. Although the work was highly speculative and very forward-looking, we would take a technology. That little slide in the middle on the plate is lab-grown meat from 2005, before it was a trendy thing. And the student was asking, what should it look like when we have lab-grown meat? Should it just be a technological product like it is now, kind of a lump? Or could it reference how meat exists traditionally, like lamb chops and pork chops and steaks, and have its own kind of aesthetic that also influenced how it tasted in the mouth? So we would kind of take things that were going on in laboratories and fast forward, and then bring them into public contexts through exhibitions, so that non-specialists could engage in discussions and reflections about where technology was going. Although it was highly speculative, we had 3 workshops each year where students could prototype electronics. That's the slide on the right. The one on the left, where we worked with Imperial College, which is like MIT in the UK, across the road from the RCA, and do a biotechnology workshop where they biohacked stuff with, under the supervisions of scientists for a week, and a filmmaking workshop that really went in detail in how to put films together. Sometimes students would latch onto these media and work very closely with biotechnology for the rest of their time. But for many, it was just an insight into how these technologies actually existed in laboratories. behind the speculations that they were doing. So that program ran for about 10 years, and it was extremely successful. We were just very lucky. It was the right moment and the right group of people in the right organization. And I think sparked, many of these people are teachers now and practitioners with studios, and kind of sparked a richness of approaches to thinking about technology and design. So just after that, we were thinking, about technology as we do, and sort of realizing it's never just technology. Technology in a communist regime, like Krzysztof Wojcicko's work early on, is very different from technology in a hyper capitalistic society. And we were asked to do an exhibition at the Design Museum to illustrate some of our thinking at that time. This was 2013. So we wanted to do a project around that. So we used this diagram. It's called the Political Compass. There's a whole website about it online. And it asks you a load of questions, and then it positions you somewhere on this matrix. And most Western governments are drifting up to the top right there, and have been for 10 years or more, where those kind of vehicles are. And with each one, we wanted to say, well, let's take a technology and a political ideology and put them together, and then take a form of transport and show how the fusion of ideology and technology gives it a very distinctive flavor. So the one on the top right is, and the way we did it, we've got 4 different, let's say, world views. And we made a matrix of things like nature. How would each of these combinations of technology and ideology view nature? So the top ones are called the digitarians. They're kind of an exaggerated version of maybe the US and most of Europe. And their technology was digital, and their politics was neoliberal. And there was a kind of slightly exaggerated version of our own society, and their transport were self-drive cars. And with each one of them, we'd look at labor, the idea of leisure, the good life, nature. So for them, nature was something to be exploited. The bottom right one are anarcho-evolutionists. They reject separate technologies and experiment on themselves. And for them, nature and them are kind of entangled. And their vehicles were all human-powered and animal-powered. Strange communal bicycles for 20 people, things like that. The bioliberals were quite idealistic, and they combined a kind of, I guess, a European social democratic outlook with technologies like synthetic biology. And they believed technology could enhance nature to meet our needs as humans without destroying it. And so their attitude towards nature maybe was a more collaborative, symbiotic one. And the top left-hand one is a collective that lives on a moving landscape, a train, basically, a vast train, several kilometers long in it, and it's nuclear powered. So they don't have to worry about energy, but they're kind of isolated from the world around them. Nature is something remote, fascinating, something to speculate on. And it's a very tightly managed, limited community. In the exhibition, the train was by far the most popular one. People kind of wanted to live on it, although they felt a little bit guilty. And the digitarians, everyone said, was the most realistic and most dystopian, which was confusing for all of us. This is a glimpse into the digitarian world where most of the landscape has been covered in tarmac so that their digital cars can roam freely. And I forgot to say it's a version, it's called the UMK at the micro because it's a version of the UK, divided into 4 shires. This is a bio car. It's a model of a little vehicle that would use hydrogen fuel cells and rotten vegetables and things like that to provide the gas. And with this, we wanted to say, if we were thinking of transport through a biotechnological lens, we'd probably have to embrace very, very different values about what we think beauty is, efficiency and so on. So in the bio world, vehicles might travel at extremely slow speeds, 10 miles an hour, for example, and concepts like speed that we've enjoyed for most of the 20th century might be seen as a historical blip. So for us, it's not enough that we just say, let's make some sustainable materials or packaging made out of mycelium instead of plastic foam, but we also have to change our mindset and our kind of fundamental understanding of our relationship to concepts like convenience, speed, time, nature, and so on. So they're kind of very slow, unstreamlined vehicles. This is a glimpse of the train. This particular one, they live inside and on the artificial landscape. As I said, it's nuclear powered, but a thorium reactor, which actually is far less harmful than the ones we have, because the byproducts can't be used for weapons. And that's one of the reasons that technology hasn't really been developed, but people are starting to look at it again now. And the train circled around the UK in loops, taking about 10 days per loop, because having a nuclear reactor, none of the other shires or communities wanted to be near it. And more recently, we've revisited it as part of our new book and designed some objects for the people who live on the train. This is one of their calendars, and it's a spatial object. Each of those loops is part of their loop around the UK. It takes 10 days. They have 360 days in a week in the year, 36 weeks. But as they travel around the UK in a circuit, over the year, the seasons change. And so their calendar is a kind of a map that is based on changing landscapes, their position in England at any one time on their circuitous loop and so on. So we wanted to play with the idea that even something as familiar as a calendar could be reconceptualized through a different technological and ideological lens. Time and space and movement through space mean something different. And so things like calendars and compasses and maps start to become different as well. And hence allow us to kind of think about the way we understand time and our tools. This is one of the communo-nuclearist uniforms. It's a set of pajamas because they live indoors most of the time, but made from Cuban fiber, which is a material used a lot for tents and outdoor equipment. This is a shot from the exhibition, and we purposefully restrained from exhibiting the research and just wanted to provide the outcomes so that people could make up their own mind about these different worlds rather than, and kind of engage with the objects as prompts to hint at worlds rather than in the science fictional way, you know, in a very detailed way, say, this is what the bioliberal world would look like. We just said, here's a car from the bioliberal world. Here's a little bit about their politics and technology. Now imagine how their education might be, how they might dress, what their attitude to healthcare is, and so on. So we're starting to try and use speculative objects to prompt further thinking. Whereas around the time of the robots and design interactions, the course we led, we were sort of taking scientific research and fast forwarding to try and highlight ethical issues that might arise and create debate around it. And our very early work was to, like the placebo furniture, was trying to sort of take a more critical approach. So I want to talk a little bit more generally now. So this is, you know, speculative thinking in design is relatively new. And you know, 10 years ago, it was quite controversial. There was lots of debate, arguments, quite aggressive critiques. Now it isn't so, now it's there and it's doing its thing. And there's lots of different variations. But in architecture, it's been around, this drawing is from nearly 250 years ago. And in fact, 250 years ago, this architect, Boulez, was saying, in order to execute as an architect to build, it's first necessary to conceive. And it is this product of the mind, this process of creation that constitutes architecture. So for centuries, architecture has been understood as this more conceptual imagining of how the world could be. And the building side, builders, buildings, is a little bit different. In design, there is no separation. We just use the word to literally mean to design something like a piece of furniture that's fully functional or design a speculative scenario. So it's relatively new in design. This is a project from the 70s by artists-architects called Ant Farm, proposing an embassy between dolphins and humans off the coast of California. And it only ever existed as a set of drawings. But again, it was quite natural for them to work it out in detail, present it, have no intention of building it, but use these drawings to have a discussion about what it means about human and non-human relationships at that time. And in a way, there's even a tradition called paper architecture, going back hundreds of years, where this is just what they do. It's ironic that many of them today now will call it speculative architecture, but actually that was around way before design. In design, it's been there for a while too. It sort of seems to emerge out of the automotive industry, where if you look at the top car on the left, that's the first concept car. And there was a model of a car built to try and suggest where cars might go in the future, stylistically and technologically, and in many other levels too. In the 50s, Citroën released the DS, this beautiful car in the top right, that was very much about trying to suggest a new meaning for transport as something at that time very futuristic and non-mechanical. So designers were doing it, but almost for marketing reasons, to say this is what cars could be, and trying to condition the public to get them ready for what industry wanted to do. So kind of related to marketing. On the bottom are two projects by architects, Buckminster Fuller on the left and Le Corbusier on the right, also cars, but driven, the one on the left, Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion, was driven by ecological and safety issues. And then he literally prototyped it. And the car on the right by Le Corbusier is a model for a competition, which he didn't win, for a car for the people. Very compact, economical, rational to make. And I think things like the Volkswagen Beetle probably evolved from this. So the architects, even at that time when they were speculating on transport, were starting with very social and critical perspectives. So one of the things we wanted to do was acknowledge that speculation has been happening in design for many decades, but traditionally was used as a marketing tool to further, I guess, capitalism, and ask what would happen if we, repositioned it in a much more critical space, as architects have been doing for centuries. And this is really what we talk about in this book, Speculative Everything, which I know some of you have read a little bit of. And in that book, we talk about examples from history. There's Walter Pickler again, some of our work, some of our students' work. And the intention wasn't to say, this is how you do it, or you should all be doing this. But here's a set of ideas about stepping away from how design is normally done and opening up a space where imagination and making and materiality can come together if we begin to think about how society could function differently. And it really seemed to capture the imagination of many, many young designers and also people working in related fields. There was designed by Kellerberger White, two graphic designers we've worked with since they were students. And that title, Speculative Everything, is made only from zeros and ones. And then the main text of the book is adopted from a typeface that IBM used in the, I think, the 60s for its manual. So they were trying to play a little bit with this kind of technological layer. In this case, they were only able to art direct the book. Okay, I want to talk very, very briefly about some different approaches that have kind of emerged in the last 10 years or more, and some issues to do with them. So this was around in 2011, so 15 years ago. And these boots suddenly appeared everywhere online. And the people were saying, are they real? Where can you get them? How much are they? And it turned out there's a design fiction. It was a speculative project. But for us, this is kind of really problematic. It's almost like using fiction to create a hoax, to pretend it's real. And of course, it succeeded in creating debate, but it feels a little bit unethical. It's sort of pretending to be real. And I think it drifts into fake news and that kind of world. And I think for us, fiction, speculation, whatever, it should look like fiction. It should be unreal. This is its function. This is its usefulness. And when it tries to, it's not fake because it's not trying to be real. It's just fictional. Just like we don't expect a novel to be real, we understand it's a piece of fiction. But at this stage, 15 years ago, lots of people were debating about whether speculative design and design fiction should try and pretend to be real, and would that make it more effective as a form of debate? This project by Superflux, two of our ex-students who are now really successful studio in London, doing this kind of work with government organizations and industries and NGOs, took a different approach. It's for an exhibition in Singapore, and it's a future version of Singapore where flooding, unfortunately, has happened. And rather than showing it in a science fictional style film or through photographic imagery, computer renderings, they borrowed an apartment and then they modeled this apartment as though we were living in 2060 or whenever it is. And the visitors to the exhibition could enter the apartment and see the tools and toys, an example of food and how they cook. So it's sort of a more immersive approach, and sometimes described as prefigurative, where it's sort of rushing off into the future and then bringing it back to the present so we can get a taste, we can actually immerse ourselves in this world that hasn't happened yet and have a more kind of visceral experience rather than an intellectual one. These two designers, Chris Wobken and Elliot Montgomery, two more of our students from the RCA, wanted to take the methods rather than the outcomes. They said these are very powerful tools for enabling people to imagine their own futures, whether it's in their individual lives, their local community, or their schools. So there's a slide on the bottom right of a beautiful book they made of their methodology, where they gather people together, often from underprivileged parts of society, and they go through workshops transferring the methods to people, but they would buy a load of cheap props from $1 shops and the like. And then at the end of the workshop, everyone would kind of hack together objects that weren't literal designs, but meant to suggest some of the objects and technologies they'd come up with. And at the same time, it wasn't their intention, but it turned out these were often quite beautiful objects, and it would draw attention to the project and enable them to become more and more ambitious with what they were doing. So this is almost more speculating as a kind of a method to empower non-designers and non-experts. This project by, I can't remember the designer's name in the bottom right, she was a student at Central St. Martin's in London at the time, and she did an internship in the Policy Lab, which is still a department in the UK government that experiments with many, many different tools from design and how they can be used in policymaking. And for a while, they were working with speculative design. And at that time, they were looking at autonomous vessels, self-driving ships or self-sailing ships. And they were doing, of course, traditional highly analytic research into the subject. And she proposed doing a speculative design project where she went to a large professional gathering of military and naval specialists who normally show the latest technologies and designed these flags for an autonomous ship, displayed them, and then used those to have conversations with the experts in a very different kind of register from more formal social science interviews, for example. So like often when ships have trouble at sea, they still use flags to communicate their status. In this case, the 5 flags at the bottom are: this vessel is autonomous, ship in lockdown, physical breach detected, this vessel is a 5G signal booster, I require human assistance, and so on. And there was apparently a really effective way of drawing these naval people and commercial shipping people into quite quirky and insightful conversations. So again, she's not proposing a future or a scenario. She's trying to use her speculative flag system as a medium to get access into some experts' insights that could feed into some policy making later on. This by the Near Future Laboratory, a group of researchers in LA who kind of generated the design fiction side of thing around the same time we were thinking about speculative design in London. And they work much more closely with industry. This is a project they did with IKEA. But I wonder sometimes if this is going back to those car designs where speculative work is starting again to overlap with marketing rather than challenge it. This is a little article from Google X, which was their kind of Blue Skies division, still is. And Nick Foster, someone we know, was the director of the design bit of Blue Skies, and his job was to bring speculative design and design fiction into their environment. And at one point, he was quite critical of the way some of the projects were going that the scientists were working on and engineers. So he did a dystopian video to kind of show internally where what they were doing might go and to provoke them into saying, is this really what you want to happen? And someone leaked that video. This was a few years ago. And the press went crazy, of course, and said Google is, trying to, whatever it was, I don't want to say what the project is, but they were, it was a highly dystopian scenario. And the idea was meant to be a critical, provocative project, got completely lost. Just the speculative part was seized upon. And Nick nearly lost his job as a result of that. But it kind of created an interesting moment within the field to sort of talk about, again, how you signal that something's a piece of fiction even in an industrial environment, rather than a propaganda or marketing video like those cars at the beginning. There's a kind of interesting space once industry starts to do this stuff where it's going to be assumed everything is about marketing. So this idea of somehow maybe keeping distance is important. This, of course, as I mentioned, the Near Future Laboratory started off in LA, very influenced by science fiction and the film culture of that part of the world and art center. We started off at the RCA in London, very influenced by literature and fine art and the kind of European perspective. And for many years, they were the kind of two main ways of thinking about this. But of course, over time, many other approaches have evolved. And quite a few of our students now who've returned to different Taiwan, Korea, Japan, China especially, are looking at how this kind of thinking can fuse with different Asian philosophical traditions and cultural traditions, how even fiction, real and unreal, is understood differently. And what speculation might start to look like through an Asian lens. And one of them I know is working on a really interesting book at the moment with MIT Press, looking at Asian concepts of time applied to speculative design that challenge futures as the only way of thinking about this stuff. This is from a project Celine Park did in Seoul in Korea, based on a trend where many young men in their 20s were committing suicide about 10 years ago. Through all sorts of problematic pressures that probably still haven't been resolved. But she proposed this kind of alternative ritual where you basically kill your identity and then are reborn in a new way into society with a new possibility. So it's about kind of looking at your finances, your ID, your identity and everything, and having a second chance if you've maybe gone down the wrong way with your life in a highly pressurized system. But she designed this most beautiful ceremony and all the props and the costumes and the movements and the sounds and produced it as a film. And there's a link there at the bottom. I'll provide this as a PDF afterwards where you can link to some of these projects. This is by Julia Lohman, and maybe it's a slightly different approach. She's looking at seaweed as a material, kelp in particular, and she was very worried if she started making clothing or chairs or tables, as many people working with biomaterials are doing at the moment. Conversations would come about of, oh, how much does it cost? Is it strong enough? Well, how would it be manufactured at scale? So she made these abstract objects to try and spark a kind of a new imaginary to us to imagine what it would be like to live in a world where biomaterials started to become more common, how the aesthetics and forms and presence of these things might change the way the world looks and feels. So it's kind of more abstract way of speculating, not on a new function or a new technology, but a new imaginary and a new way of thinking about materiality in the world. One more. This is when we were at the New School, our job was basically to bring design into conversation with the many other disciplines they have there, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and so on. But in those classes, we didn't want to say, we're going to teach you, how to do design in 15 weeks, but provide the space where a philosopher or an anthropologist could speculate in ways that they couldn't do in an anthropology class or an economics class. And I really like this project by Heather Anderson, where she was, as part of a world building class we were doing, she was imagining a country that decides to stop, to wind itself down over 100 years and to begin that process. And she was looking for a way of, she's not a designer, so she couldn't really make anything. She didn't want to do films, didn't want to just write a story. But she had before becoming an anthropologist, she was a lawyer, and she was very interested in constitutions. So the Constitution became her object, just as tables, trains, and other things become ours. And she wrote a legal document, basically, for this country called Termia, and how they would manage legally the idea that you might be born into a society that's already decided to stop in 100 years' time, and how welfare works, repair, the landscape, transport, and so on, identity. And she consulted other lawyers, as we might consult engineers, to work with the language to make sure the concepts were accurate. And it's about a 30-page long document. And I think it's a nice example of how where non-designers are speculating. We've had economics students work with investment portfolios as their medium, for example. Philosophers use thought experiments. How these other subjects can draw from their own traditions, and then doing that with designers, they enrich the whole class because designers start to see there's these other ways of another media for making little objects that hint at larger worlds. Okay. In the book, Speculative Everything, one of the things that people really seized upon was this cone called the future cone. It's not our invention. It's often called the Voroscope after George Voros, who invented it. And basically, you start with the present and you imagine the cone going out. So the first one would be the probable. What's likely to happen with AI today if we look at economics, politics, and so on in one country, say America? And then you can broaden that a little bit and say, what's kind of, so that's, yeah, what's probable? Nothing changes, this is what's likely to happen. Then you can broaden that a bit and say, well, what are alternative scenarios to that? Say there was an economic crash, or say China completely had a new breakthrough. What plausible alternatives might we consider? And then you can really go free, like a writer or a filmmaker might, and say, what's possible? What can we imagine within the current rules of reality, you know, the laws of physics, economics, and so on? And what we thought as designers is you could generate many proposals in all these sectors, bring them to the public, and then debate what a preferable future would be. And that becomes the sort of goal or target. Now, that could be in an organization, a community, a larger scale. But since then, it almost feels as though the cone of possibilities has shrunk. What we consider now as reality and what we're allowed to imagine, to us, 15 years on or 10 years on, feels extremely narrow. And when we were doing the cone, we thought the space outside the cone was the world of fantasy. Yes, you could imagine things out there, but they might be magical, or they might not relate to how economics work, or they might challenge the laws of physics. So we weren't so interested. But now we believe, actually, we need to be looking at those things. We need to be looking at more radical starting points that challenge how we think reality works. Because with the cone, you start from the present. But if the present is so problematic, as it is for many of us, even the future seems to be just a version of that. It might be a little bit better. We might have a more sustainable packaging in the future, more sustainable cars. But there's still cars, and there's still, our mindsets are still the same. We still have this problematic relationship to our environment. So these could represent different worldviews, like our United Micro-Kingdoms project, different political philosophies, different technologies, different starting points. And we can use them to kind of pull the cones back out again and re-enlarge the space of imagining that in design at least seems to have shrunk over the last 10 years. So we call this space the not here, not now. It's not necessarily a future or a past. We just step out of the here and now and we're in it. And we start imagining different sets of values, different ways of being in the world, different relationships to nature. We designed for that, and then we use those, like our calendar for the train people, to question assumptions about how we live now, our technologies now. So it's about going much deeper and questioning at a much deeper level, which I'll talk about again in a minute when it comes to sustainability. So with a lot of speculative design, the futures cone has kind of steered it towards futures. So design futures and actual futures are very similar. With things like design fiction, they borrow heavily from science fiction. So there's a little bit of a loose, it's not as analytic and structured and technical as futures forecasting, but still very much working within those conventions. And I guess our interests are much more in speculative fiction, literature, fine art, and what that brings to the conversation. So futures are going on, there's science fiction going on. Can speculative design bring a different kind of layer or a different angle to the conversation? And for us, speculation, we're interested now in untangling it from the future and saying, that's why we use the word speculative thought. What can we use speculative thinking and ideas for that complement what's already happening in sci-fi and futures? And of course, futures do speculate, and sci-fi uses speculation, but can speculation in design, art, literature do something different? And that's what we explore in our new book, Not Here, Not Now. I'm not going to go into too much detail. And again, like our other books, we try and question and explore how we write as designers, how we mix fiction and essays and theory, how we build projects into it, and so on, probably far more ambitiously than we have in other projects. And one of the things we do is we look at fields like physics, philosophy, literature, and we say, well, these areas have been speculating for hundreds of years, and they have a fantastically rich language and set of concepts for doing it. And we've looked at that and said, well, let's look at how some of that might connect with design and see if we can expand the way we think about speculation in design. So it's not always just about futures and science fiction. It can become more subtle and more nuanced and maybe more philosophical. And one of the other things we try to ask in the book is where can people encounter speculative design in society? So right now, of course, it's usually in museums and galleries and exhibitions because they're the only channels we have available to us. And personally, that's fine. You know, it's a good way of doing things. So obviously, there are some museums that are quite expensive and difficult, elitist, but there are also museums that are free in other countries, particularly, that people of all kinds can enter and engage with. But when we were doing our research, we came across this a set of prints of a patent library that existed in Washington during the 1800s. And at that time, if an inventor had an idea for something, they could register the idea, produce a set of drawings, and they had to make a model 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches and submit that. And this huge building, you can kind of see there, full of cabinets of these models. And it was open to the public. And the idea was people could come and be inspired and maybe invent a better sewing machine or a better bicycle. And it's meant to encourage a kind of creativity, but within the context, obviously, of technological progress and economic growth. But we really liked this idea and thought, well, what if there was an equivalent today that was a little bit more philosophical? And we called it an archive. It was an archive of impossible objects. And impossible because these objects don't make sense within today's economics, politics, and belief systems, but they make a different kind of sense. And can we use these objects to think about today's world differently at a much deeper level, a kind of philosophical level? So in the book, we have 12 of these. I'm only going to mention one. And they represent ideas from the edges of science, where people are debating what reality even is. Quantum computing, where people aren't sure if a quantum computer is real or not. From literature, where people invent all sorts of technologies and possibilities. And from history, where things that people thought were real 200 years ago, of course, since then have been proven to be unreal. And the idea is to say this is a kind of a museum of realities, and through design, materialize fragments of these worlds to sort of prompt us to think, well, maybe our own reality is more fluid and malleable than we're led to believe, and we should think more ambitiously and more imaginatively, especially as designers. So I'm just going to jump into one of them, this one, and it's a figure of a human imagined through non-human senses. So there's a lot of talk at the moment in design about more than human, working with non-humans, decentering the human, and so on. But often what it means is let's work with birds, for example, to make a better nest system for them, or housing system in buildings and cities. Or it's always about kind of welcoming the non-humans into an already human world. And we had been reading about in one of our classes about a theorist called von Uxküll, and a biologist from the 1930s. And he kind of said that each animal, depending on its senses, constructs a world. So a bat, for example, who sees the world or experiences the world only through sonar, doesn't really live in the same reality as us, but they live in a bat reality. And we started to wonder, well, what would the human look like in a bat reality? So we're not trying to say, let's put a virtual reality goggles on, and suddenly the room I'm in now, I see it like a bat would. It's still very human-centric. I'm trying to say, how would I appear as a human in a bat's reality to try and understand their world is very different from ours. And we need to take into consideration these many, many different kinds of worlds. So it's a very subtle point, but how we see the world matters, but knowing how the world sees us also matters. And that's what I want to talk about now in this project. Yeah, we started a little bit late, 10 minutes. There's going to be another 10 minutes. So, of course, animals see and hear at different frequencies from the humans. But on a deeper level, you know, some animal, we see there's smoke coming out of a cup on a tray. For some animals, that smoke might be more present, more real than the tray and the cup. Their eyes might not be tuned into seeing the shape of a handle on the side of a cup, but the smoke is really important. And for other animals, smoke, cup, tray is just one object. So we tried to do some exercises with a research assistant, looking at how a human might appear, not to a specific animal, but to a non-human sensory system. For example, these could be electrical fields, or they could be smell, or they could be sweat. So what we think of as our body, like my hand with a hand shape, that doesn't matter. It's the kind of cloudiness of my being that might be more important in a non-human world. Moving through space, the vibrations I create might be more important. We read that bears can smell up to a mile away. Does this mean that molecules from us travel in a chain for a mile and then enter the bear's nose and fuses with them? So, for example, in a room, if I got up and walked out now, my molecules are still lingering. So for a dog, for example, in a way, I'm still present, although for a human, I've left the room. And so rather than, this is like, when you're dealing with such an abstract concept, we could have just ended up visualizing it. We wanted to bring it back to everyday life. So we took a festival that celebrates non-human worlds as our vehicle. And in festivals, you get costumes, musical instruments, so on. We took these staffs with symbols and icons on them as our starting point. And in between festivals, these objects would live in the home, and they would act as reminders for non-human worlds. For many, many people that think, well, these, for smell, for example, should be represented in this very delicate, floaty way. But in non-human worlds, as I was saying with a dog, for example, or a bear, smell might be far more real and tangible, almost like this table is. So these traces are treated as solid, and the human is a little bit less present. We had an opportunity to exhibit these at the NGV Museum in Melbourne, and we're able to develop them. So again, testing is very important for us. The ones on the left are just drawings of the concepts to see how big they should be. And the ones on the right are months later when we worked with technical people to figure out how each one is going to be made. And again, testing, what do they feel like in relation to the human body? So we went through an amazing process with the design school at RMIT in Melbourne to develop these objects, something we could never do commercially, it would just be economically unfeasible. But in an academic setting, these experiments were an opportunity for them to figure out with CNC machining, for example, new techniques and new ways of doing that in 3D modeling. This is modeling some smoke. This is the wooden plume after the figure. It's about 4 feet long. It's the final one. This is a glove that represents a click sound radiating into the space around it as an aggressive act. And this is a backpack where you carry the equivalent of your biomass on your back. Since moving to America, we became fascinated by hiking in pretty wild places, like Alaska, for example. And when you're in these spaces, you become very aware that if something was to happen to you, you'd very quickly just become biomass or a home to other animals. You're just stuff, materiality. So this backpack in the festival is a reminder that in a non-human world, we really are just materiality. We couldn't use soil in the museum, but we worked with mycelium specialists to make a mycelium version. These are the final ones for an exhibition in London. So that was quite long. There's tons of ideas in there, but I hope we can unpack those a little bit in the discussion. I'm going to send this later. It's a link of different studios, some that I've mentioned, that approach speculative design in different ways. And also, for those of you who do want to read about it a bit more or listen, there's a couple of podcasts and some books there. And that's it.
That was fascinating. Yeah, thank you so much. That was, yeah, fascinating is the only word I can think of right now. So how do we want to do this Q&A, Ching? Do you want to just kind of go through the doc or do you want to just kind of go around the room, see if anyone has questions, then we can go to the doc or what? Yeah. Do you want a quick break? 2 or 3 minute break? Do you need a quick break before we do this, or what do you think?
It's up to you.
We're absolutely fine. Whatever works best for you, we're happy to go with.
Let's keep going then.
So let's do like how many questions like do you think we can?
Well, how long did you say your exercise will take? 15, 20 minutes?
Hang on, just have to think. Probably more like half an hour
Minimum.
if we're to, give feedback.
Okay. So we'll see. We'll take a handful of questions, see how the discussion goes. And if we have time for the exercise, we would need to start that around 12
Yes.
to make that work. So we'll just start the discussion and see how far we go. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to us.
Okay. So does anyone have a question that's just kind of popping in their brain?
There's one.
Yeah, I'm going to move this. You can.
Yeah. Can we ask a question my composer?
Roving mic.
Yeah, that's nice. It's got chair with wheels.
Chair with wheels.
It's here.
Yeah. I think that should be good.
Okay, so my question refers to that axis, that visual axis of like on the political scale, like left, right, authoritarian, libertarian. How, like, what kind of conversations and questions did you get from that exhibit? And like, how did people think that you studied it? And then how did you actually study and come up with these different sections?
Yeah, you should start.
Well, one of the things is we kind of use these as starting points for ourselves to give us some discipline in our process. But once the end results exist, it's like a scaffolding that falls away, and we don't really mind how people interpret them. In fact, we're very curious to see how people interpret and misinterpret. But I think it did get the message home that, for example, with biotechnology, if it were to, a lot of people felt, like the bioliberals were one of the groups, if the digitarians adopted biotechnology, it would be horrific. Because like our society, obviously it's so profit driven that once you start dealing with cells and human bodies and things like that, that kind of profit motive is going to lead somewhere really bad. So it's not just about how can we design biotechnological products that are really good and help us. It's how can we make a shift in the mindsets and understandings of human life, nature, and so on first, and then design biotechnology. And, that's kind of, I don't know if that's ever going to happen. So that's where speculation and fiction comes in. We can do that and introduce it into the public as a conversation. But with the chart, I'm not sure if I was clear, but if you go to the website, I mean, our students, for example, all did it, and you end up appearing somewhere. So don't know if you remember, but there was on the top right, there was the authoritarian, and down here was
It's a kind of a quiz that you ask questions, and as you ask the questions, it then puts you somewhere on that chart. So it's something you do on the internet.
An interesting thing that happened was the real world is up in the top right-hand corner, but us and our students all ended up in the bottom left-hand corner. And so you kind of realize there's a massive gap already before we even design between how we understand what the point of life is and
But we did use it really as a tool. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, we wanted to have 4 very different scenarios that were very different from each other, and it was just a method. In some ways, it was just a method that allowed us to make sure that each of the 4 things were really different from each other, so that we could compare, so that there wasn't just one one
One
future or one world. There were 4 different worlds, and these were really, really different depending on the value structures. So that it made that really explicit. And that was the only reason we kind of used that tool, I think, more than anything else. But thank you for the question. Any more? Yeah. Who's next?
Obviously, just go down the.
Yeah, I'll go. So when you're designing these new worlds and you're creating them, do you think about like simulation and simulacra? And when you build these imagined realities, like the ones you just thought of, are you thinking about, okay, so for this, our world, this is obviously like a simulacra, but do you create like an embedded reality for the worlds that you're creating?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in the beginning, we sort of thought about, world building, like you get in science fiction, cinema, or literature. We'd have to build the world first and then design the stuff for it and then show people that. But we realized that's really interesting in maybe literature, cinema, and even architecture. But as designers of small objects, little bits of the world, maybe we could do the opposite. So we come up with a world to design our stuff. But when the stuff is in the world, it hints in this way. It hints, so we call it world hinting rather than world building. So there's more ambiguity. It's different. So rather than saying we've got a message and we want to communicate this message about what the best world is through our design, we're going, we don't know what the best world is, but this one certainly has problems. Can we design stuff that sparks other people's imaginations to also start thinking about what a better or different world would be? And so hinting.
Yes, the hinting is nice because it gives a little prompt. It doesn't say everything.
Yeah.
So what's really nice is that there's tons of room for everyone. So everyone, all of you, with one hint, could make another, 20 worlds again. That's it again. Again, another tool.
It's like a chain reaction rather than the designer sort of knows it all, designs something and transmits that knowledge. The designer makes something that stimulates people's imaginations to get them thinking and excited and imagining as well. In theory.
Heather?
Yeah, so I'm curious about sort of the ideation process. I imagine like one of the big important parts of it is being culturally aware, and I'm just curious, like, how some of those ideas, where they start, where they come from, and also like how as a designer, how you stay culturally aware.
What do you mean by culturally aware in this case?
I guess sort of like aware of the way that society is changing, because it seems like a lot of your projects involve like the way society is changing.
Yeah, I think there are obviously very sophisticated tools and processes for doing that in anthropology, in the social sciences, and so on. But we look a little bit more to the fine art world and writers and filmmakers. So part of it's having your antenna, being sensitive to what's happening around you, obviously looking at the news, looking at a broad range of media, not getting trapped in a bubble. And but then when it comes to ideation, I think we purposefully encourage people to draw from your own subjectivity. And in the debate that's happening at the moment about AI, for example, and how that's impacting on design, it feels to us that your own individual starting point maybe is extremely valuable when AI can simulate all sorts of generic positions, like a young 25-year-old living in New York, it'll come up with a world based around that, but not your unique situation. So it creates tension in design because often, people are told you have to use very objective methods to try and analyze, like ethnography, to try and understand a community. But we try, in the kind of work we do, this kind of work we're talking about, we feel it's okay actually to draw from your own insights and interests.
And the other thing is, like, you're all a class of 20 people from very different backgrounds, from different kinds of disciplines. And most of the classes that we're running, we are literally with very different disciplines. And so one of the lovely things is that if there are 20 people around the table with 20 different ideas, we collectively try and work out what, everyone pulls together. Oh, have you heard about this? Have you seen that? And it's a kind of a network of, it's not you as an individual, you're working with 20 other minds, and the ideas that come up are bounced around between 20 other minds. So it's really interesting. Each generation has a different set of ideas, and each class has a different set of a different set of ideas and a different set of issues. Each year it changes, so the change is the part of this process anyway. And I think having multiple perspectives of doing this kind of method with 20 people is a really good way of making sure that there are lots of different opinions and things in the room.
So with the last project, for example, the one about the clouds and forms, that started with the idea of an Umwelt that we read about in a theoretical book as part of one of the classes we teach. And we just thought this is really interesting, and it's a different way of thinking about this stuff from being culturally aware, what we're seeing happening in design at the moment. So it is more or less, let's see where this goes. And then after a while of working with it, we go, oh, this is actually interesting. It's generating stuff. And you keep going. Then you go, hang on, it's getting really abstract now. We don't want to just do visualizations of figures. How do we bring this back to design again? So it's like a journey where you're asking all the time, is this working? If it's not, how can we fix it? If it is working, let's keep going. Based on trusting our own kind of instincts. I know that doesn't always work in design because you do have to work with more objective data. But in this kind of field, sometimes drawing from what you're curious about and passionate about can actually turn out to be quite unique and fresh and of interest to other people as well.
I also think that's again, because you're coming from different classes, you'll have a lot of input with whatever the current ideas that are circulating. You're about what's happening in society. You're doing them already. They're in your classes. But this is an opportunity to step out a little bit and and be able to loosen the imagination a little bit with another group of people. So you're bringing all that with you. That's not going to go away. It's just that then we're helping to loosen it up a little bit so that you can help loosen up your imagination, because it's actually quite hard to work like this. Everyone thinks, oh, it's easy, you just come up with ideas. Actually, it's not.
So
don't worry. It is. We always think it's it's a difficult process to go through. So don't worry about
for example, with that last project again, where I very briefly mentioned the festival. Obviously, a festival like that's not going to work in our world. There's going to be no festival, at least in Western European and American societies, there are in others, celebrating non-human worlds. So we have to say, okay, this doesn't make sense. It's like one of our impossible objects. It doesn't fit today's reality. But let's think it through and imagine a world, a parallel world, where this is what they celebrate. Instead of St. Patrick's Day, they have a Many Worlds Day. Or with the Archive of Impossible Objects, in today's world, the world we're in, this sounds very artistic and intellectual and specialist, but we imagine a society where those kinds of archives just exist in all sorts of towns and they're part of everyone's life. So that's the jump we have to make, is when you're coming up with new ideas, it's not so much, oh, it doesn't fit, it doesn't make sense. How can I make it make sense? It doesn't make sense. So how can I tell a story about a world where it does make sense? And that world's probably going to be very different from the world we're in now. And that's the value. You create a tension, a contrast, a spark, a buzz. And it's difficult because we also find that when we're designing things, we think of it, oh, we have to make it realistic. People wouldn't behave like that. People wouldn't want that. No one's going to have a festival with a teapot and a pole. So you say, well, in another society, they might, and here's why they would do that. It's difficult because, it's easy to just come up with random wacky stuff, but trying to do it in a way where it creates tension between today's world and a fictional world. And this is obviously what you're exploring in this class, takes a bit of skill.
Let's have one more question, and I think we should get to the imagination so that we can do some stuff. Because one thing I was thinking of is, like, if anyone has a question, they're going to hang out with us all semester. So let's just go through that. Ask those questions all semester. So I think somebody had a question, and then we'll get to the activity.
Okay. This question is in context of is it for the creation of my thesis, and based off of a quote that was in chapter 3 about darkness as an antidote to naive sentiment utopianism can jolt people into action. How can design perform the normalization of violence without becoming complicit?
Yeah, that's a very hard one. I mean,
open that up a little bit.
the normalization of violence.
Well, obviously, don't want to normalize violence.
No, that's something to confront. I think this is where it gets really complicated. You know, traditionally we'd say in a design thinking mindset, how do we solve for violence? What do we need to do? How do we change things? Drawing a little bit more from the literary artistic world, we'd say you kind of set up a contrast. You show what a not, you know, a non-violent. We're talking very general here, but if we zoomed in on a specific situation, you might show how things could play out differently in a society where you might say, for example, raising your voice. This is fiction, it's silly, and I'm thinking on my feet. But raising your voice just doesn't happen. It's just not allowed. It's like taking my clothes off in public in our society. It's just not going to happen. So you play with changing certain rules and you build scenarios around that and use them maybe to talk about our own society. You know, I can't do this in such a short time, but I think what I'd say is it's trying to avoid solving complex social political issues and saying, you know, as you said, are there other ways that design can draw it or offer a doorway into a different world? You can't say, right, this is how we would fix it. If we all behaved like this from now on, it wouldn't happen. It's like, let's, you know, just like taking our clothes off in this society is not going to happen. In certain contexts in Germany, for example, it's absolutely fine. Could our voice and raising your voice start to have taboos associated with it, rules and etiquette that make us think about shouting? I know that's different from the violence you're probably talking about, but even shouting could be conceptualized very differently.
Using metaphor and sort of, you know, and I guess it's about nuance, and exactly we talk about in design, it's about craft. I think in this kind of area, crafting ideas and nuance into the language that's used, how you shape that language, the things you say. I think there's a lot of crafting in for a thesis project. You know, even the words and the way that you propose something, it's not so much in the message, it's actually how you do things become much more important. So I think the craft becomes an important part of that process of making those kinds of projects. And again, I would say they're quite a difficult thing to do, and they take a lot of crafting and shaping and also testing with, you know, various communities to see what that feels like. So you're not just taking for granted what you think. So I think that's all kind of part of that. But, you know, when we meet you, you can talk a little bit more when we're in person, it'll be much easier. But thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so tell us what to do next.
Okay, I might share the screen again. Okay, just going to dive straight in. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the concept of legal personhood for rivers is the idea that rivers have rights and deserve protection from environmental degradation. It's based on the idea that rivers have intrinsic value and should be recognized as having the same rights as living people. And there are various examples around the world. So if we take that as a starting point.
Tony, your screen didn't share.
The screen didn't share.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to do it. Where's the share button? Sorry about that, thanks.
Here, but so leave it there.
Yeah.
Do you have this printed out?
No.
We'll
leave it on the screen.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're starting with the idea of legal personhood for rivers. So we're saying in different parts of the world, this is happening at the moment. So in our world, it's not the case, where you live probably and where we live. So it's a kind of shift in the understanding of what a river is, a river's rights. So I read the thing. The concept of legal personhood for rivers is the idea that rivers have rights and deserve protection from environmental degradation. It's based on the idea that rivers have intrinsic value and should be recognized as having the same rights as living people. And usually this is to do with land use and things like that. So in this exercise, the prompt is, as legal personhood for rivers spreads around the world, and possibly from rivers to lakes to other water sources, describe a scenario or even a world where this changes our relationship to water in general and how we might live differently. So even drinking water or washing in water might start to take on a new meaning because rivers now have personhood. So for the exercise, you need to choose an area like leisure, hygiene, utilities, bathing, just something very quickly, washing,
To do with water.
anything to do with water.
Look at water differently. Through this, if its legal identity is different, and when it enters our home or anywhere where water is present, how we might look at it differently and behave differently.
So propose a new ritual, institution, or infrastructure. So, for example, how might swimming pools change? Saunas, baths,
New types of water facility.
drinking water. If water has rights, how does that change our relationship to water?
To drink it before we drink it. No. So it's just a very so we want you to be in groups, and we'll probably give you we'll put can we send it or put it up, and we should have sent it in advance.
Yeah. Shall we just leave it on the screen, or can you see that
On the
now?
screen. That prompt on the screen is perfect, I think.
Just like that.
Yeah. And if you I think Jed and Ching have made some groups so that you can go into groups and then spend probably about 15 minutes.
Yeah. And then how many groups are there?
Jed?
7.
Seven.
Groups. So if they're 2 minutes each, that's 15 minutes.
So yeah, whatever time we've got left.
At what time do we end? Is it?
12:30.
Okay, so let's say 10 minutes.
10 minutes, just to literally have a quick go at it.
Don't stress, don't worry.
Don't worry.
And you can do it verbally, just imagine if water's, just do it in your groups. And then what we'll do is we'll ask you to just tell us verbally
The kinds of conversations,
What-
things you came up
what
with.
new ritual or something you've come up with very quickly within 2 minutes. And we'll only be able to give the most minimal of feedback.
Good
It's
to
more
know.
the process.
Yeah.
So you have 10 minutes to do it.
On the board.
Oh, okay, I see one number. Okay, I'll wait for it.
Oh, we're already.
Show with that. Watch my. Oh,
Let's just go in order. So can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Maybe go in order, maybe one or, a quick summary of kind of the contract or ritual, institution, or infrastructure each group came up with. Whoever is talking might need to come closer to the robot.
Can you hear us okay?
Yep.
You're good.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
So I'm Cornelia. I'm a member of Group 1 together with Simon and Kelsey. So we talked about a lot of different things, but one of the things we talk about with personhood is that rivers are not static. They move, especially after a big storm can happen. A river can move like dozens or even hundreds of meters to the side. How would you deal with that if a river has personhood? For the personhood, would it be then more justified to artificially try to get the river back in its original spot, or just leave it where it's flowing, especially if currently the state of the river is impeding on the personhood or the livelihood of someone else? What kind of institutions or structures would need to be established for a situation like that?
And did you discuss the actual materiality of the water at all? How you might that be treated differently?
Yeah, we also talked about a little bit about whether the personhood of the river would that be more defined by a location, by the actual water that is flowing inside the river, or more specifically by just the flow of the river itself, where it's not the location of the river or the water of the river, since both of those change, but more like the flow of the river, where it starts and where it ends up. So that is also something we discussed.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go quickly so we can hear everyone's thoughts. So we don't. Thank you. Who's up next?
Two. All right, I'm from group 2. We discussed kind of like the utilities part of water, and like we all use water for a lot of different things, and like how do we kind of like track that in a way? Because like we thought about water at first as like a sentient thing, but then it's like water is a molecule, it's not sentient. So like how do we track the legal personhood of it? But the first thought we had was like, do we have to use like all the water that we use in our households, like for utilities, does that need to be replenished back? And then like what happens if we like drink water from a different source, like at school, and then go home and then use the bathroom and like and then use that, like that water is taken from somewhere else and then but put back in our house? Like does like it's kind of like a strange thing, like how do you track that? And like how do you like for example, I think Raleigh, part of our water system comes from a lake, and so do we try to make sure that like we take all the water that we use from that lake, do we try to replenish it back? It's kind of a strange thing to think about, especially with weather. I don't like how water evaporates and then like goes somewhere else. So
No, that's lovely. And you can imagine now designing some of those tools for putting the water back. And those objects we see them and go, what kind of world do these belong to? We see it's a world where water has a different meaning, and it helps us think about our world differently. So it's a nice example. Okay, thank you. We'll just keep moving to make sure we see everyone.
Thank you.
So we talked a lot about what kind of life would look like, especially the house and living situations. So we thought that pipes might not exist anymore because that on-demand water would kind of go against the consent of the water. Like it doesn't choose to come into your home at that point. So we talked about a restructuring of a society where people live closer to the rivers, and how in other cultures that journey to the river, to the lake is important for cultural experience and spirituality. So we kind of mostly talked about, that like a world where we didn't have pipes and we had to find new ways to get to the water and access it and create culture and community around that.
It's like free the water, free the water, free the water.
I love when you said you don't have its consent for it to come into your home.
Yeah.
But again, obviously, if we start thinking about this too much, we go, oh, it's not realistic. People never walk to rivers and all that. But that's the point with the fiction is we say, well, in what kind of society does that make sense? And how are they organized and so on? And we kind of, so it's a really nice starting point again of how you could build out a community that prioritizes the idea you just had.
Yeah, because when you get down to the detail of then the interface, those interfaces are going to really change in relation to a home. Even homes are going to change. So if you keep following through, those things are going to everything's going to come out very different. But thank you.
Thank you. Next one.
Next one.
Just set it again.
Hi.
Hello.
So we discussed the ritual of bathing and how someone would probably intrinsically be motivated to save water rather than extrinsically, and how we thought that was kind of nice.
Yeah, washing with as little as possible.
But what I mean, if the water has personhood status, do you think it would change the way we feel about washing?
Yes, it would make me uncomfortable. You might feel guilty.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was 4.
Yeah.
Just gonna scooch over like this. So we talked about a few different things. The first thing we were kind of talking about was like water preservation. Because you're thinking about the river as just the water. So in places where it's like maybe water is a more precious or valuable resource, like there's less of it. You can have homes where there are like a designated amount of water you can use, and then there's fines for using more than that. And then we started thinking, well, if the river, maybe the river, like the ecosystem of the river is what constitutes the river. So like there's a little bit more to the river than just the water. So we started talking about like different ways of or different parameters around permitting things that go into water. So things that are like hard surfaces that when like a current like pushes up against it, it's not going to bounce back and ruin all the bottom of like a river floor or like destroy ecosystem. And then the other thing was satellite mapping of like the bottom of a river, so you can evaluate like the health of vegetation, for example, on the bottom of the river, and then use that as like a metric to like maintain the health of a river.
I really like the way you expanded the river. Again, it's kind of very human-centric of us, Fiona and I, to think of the river as just this watery thing. Whereas, as you said, it kind of leaks into the world around it. Yeah, the ecology and the ecosystem.
Yeah, that becomes something.
Yeah, does the water stop and the rest of the world begin? And then also, when you were saying about satellite, that's again to me stepping outside of the human belt,
into
where
the technological.
Another, in this case, technological being is seeing water differently from us. It can see the base. That's really nice sort of hints of
shifts, very small nuances, but those nuances help to see with very different kind of criteria of which to design with. So thank you.
Right. Next one.
Hello, Group 6. And we basically discussed about a river having its own sort of like decision-making process. So we had we thought of aqueducts and creating an output for it, and the river can choose to go into this aqueduct, and that's how sort of humanity collects it. And we also talked about in the aqueduct, it has different routes it can go in. So like one for like bathing, one for drinking, one for like just collection or a reservoir to have it. And the river chooses if it wants to go in those routes. So sort of like by gravity or friction, or just like randomability. But that would result in sort of like, let's say there was a drinking option and then the river chooses not to go into the drinking option that much, then people would conserve the water more and view it as something more of a commodity or like, so the river chooses for itself in that sense. And we thought that would result to people sort of worshiping the river, and that sort of creating different fractions into like the river. So, but yeah, that was basically our idea.
Yeah, that'd be some engineering, wouldn't it, to work out? Because when you go into the dynamics of water movement, I bet there would be some really amazing machine to work out what the river, what the river flow is.
But it's interesting even to think about dam design, from a slightly muted version where you do say some of the water is allocated for drinking and some for other things, and somehow a dam isn't just a huge container that is released, but starts to be managed very differently and in combination with the water. It's interesting.
Yeah. Again, shifting our perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the final group, is it? 7.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm May from group 7. We imagined, we took leisure and we imagined a more transitional period of water rights where all rivers have rights, including lazy rivers. So we imagined a water park filled with concrete, except for the lazy river, which has a right for like non-chemical filtration of its water instead of